This is the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zaccheus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was. But because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zaccheus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zaccheus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. Please be seated. My sister is a doctor of art history. She is the brains of the operation when it comes to our family. And while she was in school, becoming a doctor, she met a young man who was on the same track. And so now they are the doctors of art history. And I can tell you that going to a museum with them is quite a treat. I love going with Ben and Sarah, my sister, because they can show you and tell you the intricacies of a piece of art and the symbolism and the history and information about the artist. And I can ask them questions and be enlightened. Although sometimes, and there was this one time where my sister said, "Look, you've asked me a lot of questions and I've talked a lot about this particular painting. Sometimes, though, you need to stop and let the painting speak for itself. So let's just be quiet for a moment." This passage from the Gospel according to Luke is one that we need to let speak for itself, and speak it will. Many of you have heard this story about Jesus and Zaccheus. Some of you might be hearing it for the first time or the first time in a long time. It is a powerful encounter with Jesus, and I thought we might take a look at it verse by verse and let it speak for itself. If you have your leaflet, you can look at it, or if you'd like to turn to page 1069 in your red Bible, we can go through it together. This story comes to us from chapter 19 of Luke, and verse 1 says that Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. So a note on geography: Jericho is quite close to Jerusalem, several miles away. And so what this means is that Jesus had almost finished his journey to the holy city. He was traveling from Galilee all the way down to Jerusalem. He knew what would happen to him when he got to Jerusalem. We know what would happen to him when he got to Jerusalem. And he has almost now finished his journey. He finds himself in Jericho. Now we're told in verse 2 that there was a man who lived in Jericho named Zaccheus. And it says he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. That's verse 2. Now a word about tax collectors. Some of you may have heard about this in a Bible study sometime, that tax collectors back in Jesus' day were far different than tax collectors in our day. In our day, tax collectors are civil servants, and regardless of what you might think about the IRS, we acknowledge that these folks have a job to do, and they are pretty much just doing their job. Although I did hear a joke about a woman who went to the doctor, and the doctor said, I have bad news. You're terribly sick. I give you 2 years at best. She said, "What do you think I should do?" The doctor said, "Well, you're single, so I recommend that you go out and marry an IRS tax accountant." And she said, "Oh, will that prolong my life?" And the doctor said, "No, but it'll feel longer." That joke notwithstanding, we acknowledge that people who work with taxes today are just doing their jobs. They're loyal citizens. Not so in Jesus' time. Zacchaeus was not a civil servant. He was an independent contractor who worked for the Roman government, and he was given a quota of denarii, of money that he needed to collect, a quota per month, a quota per year. And as long as he delivered that quota to the Romans, they didn't care how he collected it or how much extra he collected for his own salary. And so there was extortion, and there was manipulation, and there was over-collection. And Zacchaeus, we are told, was quite good at all these things because he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. A better modern-day example for someone like Zacchaeus would be a crooked pawn shop owner. Or, if you want to go all the way up the ladder, Bernie Madoff is a modern analogy to Zacchaeus, tax collector. He was a Jew himself who overcollected from fellow Jews, and he would have been hated and despised. Not too many relationships for Zacchaeus, the tax collector. Until one day, when this itinerant preacher from Nazareth came walking into his town, and at first, Zacchaeus just wanted to take a look at this Jesus. But what unfolded was one of the most intense encounters in all of the New Testament. And I've broken it up into 5 phases, if you will. This encounter between Jesus and Zacchaeus. There is attraction, number 1. Number 2, communication. Number 3, connection. Number 4, conversion. And number 5, affirmation. And I've made them all rhyme to help us out. We can go verse by verse, and it says, verse 3, he, Zacchaeus, wanted to see who Jesus was. Attraction. He's heard about Jesus. He wants to get a closer look. He's not sure about this guy, but he's fascinated and drawn to him. Many of us have been there, or we know people in our lives who are just kind of attracted to Jesus. They're not sure about him, not sure if they want to give their life to him, but there's something that fascinates them. This is the reason why at St. Mary's we run the Alpha Course. At the Alpha Course, people kind of come and say, I'm really fascinated by this guy Jesus, but I'm not sure. I need more evidence. I need more information before I think about giving my life to him. If that's you, well then I'll see you at the Alpha Course next fall. Or if you have a friend like that, bring them to the Alpha Course. Attraction. And that's where Zacchaeus is. He doesn't want to talk to Jesus, so he climbs a tree just to take a look. Well, phase 2 shows up in verse 5, where it says, Jesus reached the spot. He looked up at him and said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Communication. Jesus stops, he calls, he communicates with Zacchaeus, and we cannot underestimate the significance of the fact that he calls him by name. Zacchaeus. We know that in other parts of the gospel, Jesus makes a general announcement. He says, anyone who has ears to hear, let them listen. This here is not an all call. It is a specific communication to one person, Zacchaeus. And then he says, I must stay at your house today. The Greek word is dei. It's an imperative. It's like the sun must rise in the east. Not, I might stay at your house, but I must. It must be so that I come to your house today. And so we have this second phase, which is communication. What happens? Well, what happens is connection. If you look at verse 6, it says, so he, Zacchaeus, came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Now, it doesn't get specific, but what that implies is that he welcomed him into his house, and they would have broken bread together. The rules of hospitality state that when a guest arrives, a meal is shared. And so they would have sat and ate and broken bread and fellowshipped and been in each other's presence. This Zacchaeus and this Jesus, this unlovable character, he probably hadn't had a meal like that with anyone in a long time. And here is the famous rabbi showing love and and acceptance and compassion to Zacchaeus, the tax collector. And there's a connection. And it's because of that connection that Zacchaeus responds with conversion. And that shows up in verse 8. So if we look at verse 8, it says, Zacchaeus stood up and he said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." He goes above and beyond the Old Testament law, which proposed a tenth. He says, I'll go above 10%, I'll give half. And then if I've cheated anybody out of anything, and he had cheated many people out of many things, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Conversion. 180. He responds to Jesus by transforming his life. And then the 5th phase, affirmation. Jesus affirms him in verse 9. It's an affirmation of salvation because he says, "Today salvation has come to this house." And those words are very important because he says today and this house, now and here. You know, in later on in the gospel, Jesus will say to the thief, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Well, that's somewhere else, sort of. And there are other parts of the Gospels where Jesus talks about heavenly rewards. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. That is to say, you will be rewarded at a different time and in a different place. But here he says to Zacchaeus, your salvation has come today, to this house, to this place, and at this time, your salvation is here. And we can swap out the word salvation for something more familiar, freedom. This theme that runs throughout the entire narrative of the Bible, freedom. And he offers Zacchaeus a chance to be free from the person who he was and the things that he did. Today, salvation has come to this house. So of these 5, attraction, communication, connection, conversion, affirmation, seems that conversion, this notion of transformation, this notion of people turning around a life and actually changing a whole person, is at the heart of Christianity. It's what separates Christianity from being just kind of an intellectual pursuit or sort of a spiritual wandering into a lived experience where change really does happen. And this can be fascinating and perplexing to people who haven't seen it before. I'm thinking of someone called Ira Glass. He is the host of a radio show called This American Life on public radio. Some of you have probably stumbled upon it. It's one of the more famous radio shows now on public radio, and Ira Glass is quite a famous journalist doing extraordinary work. And one of the stories that he did a while ago was on gangs in Chicago. Now, Ira Glass himself is an atheist, self-affirmed atheist, not hostile toward people of faith, but just himself an affirmed atheist. And he ran into 2 Christian pastors in Chicago who pastored to gang members. And they called themselves missionaries to the gangs in Chicago. Well, the first thing that surprised Ira is that these were the only people that anybody in the gangs trusted. They didn't trust the cops, they didn't trust the politicians, they didn't trust anybody else, but they would talk to the missionaries. They would talk to the pastors. And it was only through the pastors that Ira was able to talk to the gang members to get his story. And then he found out that what the missionaries were doing is convincing some of the young teenagers who were in the gangs to leave the gangs and give up a life of crime and drugs and turn their life around and give their life to Christ. And to everyone's amazement, there had been dozens of these kids who did exactly that. Talk about a 180. Leaving a gang, leaving drugs and crime, and giving your life to Christ, and it was happening. And so Ira Glass, as atheist, is kind of looking at this and saying, I always thought of Jesus as kind of this intellectual exercise, but here there's a real power. How are you doing it? And they said, well, it's not us, it's Jesus, and it's the power of the gospel. And by the way, did you ever think that we thought we would be living in Chicago in some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country doing this work? That's Jesus too, said these missionaries. Glenn and James Fitzgerald were their names. So whether it's a gang member in Chicago in 2013 or a tax collector 2,000 years ago hiding in a tree, this notion of conversion and transformation is still at the heart of Christianity. For Zacchaeus, his conversion revolves around money. And so we just need to talk about that a little bit, and I want to say sort of three things about Zacchaeus' conversion around money. The first thing to say is that Zacchaeus didn't stop thinking that money was important. There's kind of a myth out there that says Christians are supposed to think that money doesn't matter, or that when you become a Christian, you say, money's not important anymore. That's just not quite true. Jesus knew that money was important. He spent a huge chunk of the Gospels talking about money. Jesus knew that it's not so much because money matters to God, but because money matters to us. And all of us have money in our lives, and the place of money in our lives affects our priorities and the way we kind of carry out our journeys. So Zacchaeus didn't suddenly stop thinking that money was important, but what he did was change the destination. I give up half to the poor. I'll pay back 4 times who I've cheated. Money was still important, but he changed money from building up the kingdom of Zacchaeus to building up the kingdom of God. That was the conversion. The second thing to say is that it was a response. Zacchaeus didn't have this conversion and this change of attitude toward money because he just kind of gritted his teeth and clenched his fists and made it happen. He was responding to the connection that Jesus made with him and the love and unconditional love that Jesus showed for him. Again, if you look at attraction, communication, connection, conversion, and affirmation, Jesus is the one that's doing most of the work. And the conversion comes because Zacchaeus was responding to it. So much of what we do as Christians, some might argue everything that we do as Christians, has to come as a response to what Jesus has already done for us. And then the third thing to say is that it's a process. Conversion doesn't always happen all at once. It's a process. I know that for me in my life, there are areas that seem to be taking quite a while, or have taken quite a while. Anyone who is in a 12-step program or has been close to somebody in a 12-step program knows that the 12 steps take a while. It's a process. It's a journey. I remember the first time I heard a priest or a pastor talk about tithing in a sermon, and I thought, wow, that is a very nice and noble idea for other people to do. It's taken us a while, but as soon as Danielle and I started at St. Mary's, we've been tithing, doing our 10%, and that's something that we'll be doing for the rest of our lives. I'm not going to say that tithing is fun or easy, although I've talked to people who have started tithing and they say that it's a lot easier than they ever thought it was going to be. But the point is, it's a process. We're on a journey here. And the real good thing about Jesus is that once he calls us by name, and once we give our lives to Christ, he's got a strong grip, doesn't he? Once we're in Jesus' hand, he's not in the business of letting anyone go. got a strong grip. And so we know that there will be doubts along the way. There will be ruts along the way. We're all bound to get stalled or stuck in our Christian journeys. Zacchaeus probably got stalled or stuck somewhere along the line in his new journey. But Jesus isn't letting us go. Our salvation cannot somehow be lost. We can't fall out of grace. And so just turn back to verse 9. In these times of ruts, and let the words fall on us like a mist. Today, salvation has come to this house, because this one, too, is a son or daughter of Abraham.